In this lesson, we will inspect the web application features provided to us by Spring Boot's auto configuration for Spring MVC. Many developers working with Spring Boot enjoy this feature with limited knowledge of the underlying components and their purpose. We'll be taking a deeper look at what is provided by Spring MVC auto configuration so that you understand the components provided for you by Spring Boot. To help us get started, I've placed a simple Spring Boot project that uses Spring MVC within our working files directory. The project was created using a Spring Starter project specifying the web dependency as we have seen in previous lessons. To get started, let's inspect the project structure. So you'll notice that we have the source main resources source folder, and we see our application.properties file as we've worked with. But you'll also notice the static directory as well as the templates directory. And within these two directories, I have placed a CSS file as well as an index.html file and a viewresolver.html file. Now, these are very simple front-end resources that we're going to be using throughout this lesson. First, I'd like to show you how Spring Boot's auto configuration for web applications allows us to easily display static resources. So I'm going to go ahead and I will relaunch our Spring Boot application, and then I'm going to navigate over to our browser. From the browser, we can just hit the context root, and you'll see that we get this message in red that says this is the entry point to the application. So let's talk a little bit about what happened. Well, first, I want to talk about something we don't see. You do not see a web XML file anywhere within our project. In fact, you won't even see a declaration of the dispatcher servlet. The dispatcher servlet is automatically configured for you by adding the Spring Boot application annotation to our application class and by having the starter web dependency within our pom.xml file. This will automatically cause a dispatcher servlet to be registered to the root of our application. So every request will be initially processed by the dispatcher servlet. Now, the reason we were able to see our index.html file, even though we have not specified a request mapping to index.html, is because out of the box, as long as we have our index.html file within one of our static resource directories, Spring Boot auto configuration will map our root context to index.html. So this is where we saw our page being displayed, and here we see the markup for that page. Now you'll also notice that we have included the index.css file, and that is contained within our CSS directory inside of our static resources. So here's what I'm getting at. If you have ever manually configured a Spring MVC project, you know that you need to specify the directory of your static resources. And this tells the dispatcher servlet to neglect those directories or those paths when you are processing requests through the dispatcher's front controller pattern. So by default, Spring Boot Auto configuration will specify the static, public, or resources directories as special directories that we will use for serving static resources, and you no longer need to configure that manually on your own. If we inspect our application class, you'll see more proof of Spring Boot Auto configuration in action. So you'll notice that we have specified the request mapping annotations, and these instruct Spring to use request mapping handler mappings, as well as a request mapping handler adapter. And that's how we enable the use of the request mapping feature in order to route requests to the specific controller methods. Now, normally we would have to register the request mapping handler mapping within a Spring MVC application. But luckily for us, since we have included Spring Web MVC on our class path by way of the starter POM, we have those components registered for us behind the scenes without our knowledge. And that's how a lot of the auto configuration works. These components are just registered for you and you're not really aware of them. And then you use something like request mapping without even thinking about it. So you'll notice that we have specified a request mapping to the /view resolver URL. And that path will navigate to a view resolver template that we have set up within the templates directory. If we take a look at our pom.xml file, you'll notice that we have included the Spring Boot starter timeleaf starter dependency, and that instructs Spring Boot to configure components in the background that will handle view resolution of our timeleaf templates. In fact, what you'll see is that we get a timeleaf view resolver. So we're able to take the logical view name of view resolver and map that to one of our actual timeleaf templates. So if we navigate to our browser and we fire a request against that URL, you'll now notice that our timeleaf template is displayed for us, and that is all handled by beans configured by Spring Boot behind the scenes. You'll find that by having the Spring Boot application annotation on your application and having the Spring Web MVC dependency on your class path, it's very much like having the Enable Web MVC annotation in place from the Spring MVC project. It provides you with a number of essential Spring MVC beans that you'll need for your project. Another bean provided by Spring Boot's auto configuration is the Content Negotiating View Resolver. This bean allows us to return a particular response depending upon the content type requested by the request. So, for example, we have the /cat path mapped to the cat method on our controller. And this controller method is annotated with the response body annotation. And this means that the returned object from our method will be written directly to the response body for our request. So for example, if I returned a string, that string would be what is passed back to the client that has made the request as part of the response body. In our case, we are returning an object cat, and we would expect to see that serialized to a particular form. Now, when this occurs, when we get a request in for a particular content type, the Content Negotiating View Resolver makes that decision about what we return. So let's take a look at the Content Negotiating View Resolver in action. If we navigate to our browser, and then we can hit the /cat resource, and here you see that we get a JSON representation of our cat object. Now, if we return to our pom.xml file, we can add the Jackson data format XML artifact to our POM file. So let's go ahead and add the dependency. We'll just type Jackson, and that's going to give us a number of options. And we will click the Jackson-data format-XML artifact, and we will save our pom.xml file. And now let's relaunch our Spring Boot application. And once the application is relaunched, we can navigate back to the browser and specify we'd like to see the cat in XML. And there we get an XML representation of our cat. And that's made possible by adding in our Content Negotiating View Resolver that is included behind the scenes by Spring Boot, and also adding in our dependency upon the Jackson XML serialization and deserialization artifact. You also see that you can request JSON using the actual extension. And if we do request something that is not available, let's make up a file type. It does have a default that it corresponds to. Finally, let's take a look at one last feature provided to us by the auto configuration. If we were to navigate to a path that is not mapped, you'll notice that we have a default error page configured for us, and that's provided by Spring Boot Auto Configuration for our web app. So there's all of this configuration that's provided for us, and there's all these beans that are registered for us behind the scenes through auto configuration. And that saves us a lot of time as a developer. Less time configuring and more time developing.